So we're now live. We will welcome, if you're joining us for the final session of today. This is going to be a very exciting one. I'm really looking forward to hearing from the Baobab Foundation about their Digging Deeper report. We will just give we've got quite a lot of people signed up for this event, so we'll just give people a couple of minutes, give Zoom a couple of minutes to get everybody in. I don't know about you, but it's absolutely hammering it down with rain where I am again. Has it just started?
We've had, so I'm actually based in Bristol, and we had huge amounts of rain this morning, and now the sunshine is out beautifully.
We've got it the other way around. I actually sat outside to eat my lunch, and now it's, still, at least it's not the hailstones that we had yesterday. So just give it another couple of minutes. Put the audio transcription on. So you will have subtitles at the bottom of your screen, which you can turn off if you want them, if you don't want them, but there if you do. Right, I think I'll start with the welcome spiel whilst people continue to come in. So welcome everyone to the London Funders Festival of Learning. We are, this is our first 6-day learning festival, and we're at the end of day 5, and it's been a very, very exciting journey so far. So you'll know that I'm Geraldine Blake. I'm the Director of Collaboration at London Funders. Our job is all about helping our members to be effective by convening, supporting them to cooperate and collaborate, and all with the end result of helping people across London's communities to live better lives. And the festival is a way of drawing together our members to reflect on the extraordinary year that we've all lived through together, extraordinary and challenging, and in some ways very inspiring. We want to highlight the work, some of the brilliant work that's been going on in civil society organisations. We want to reflect on some of the ways in which funders have been doing things differently. We want to be honest about what worked, about what didn't work. And the point of all of this is that we build a platform for change, a movement for change amongst funders, so that where we can make the capital a better place for all Londoners, and share that learning, of course, across the UK and wider. So we've been delighted to have people from outside of the UK joining us for some of these sessions. So this is the session on the Baobab Foundation's report, Digging Deeper. It's a webinar, so you can see us, but we can't see you. Please use the Q&A box to post questions, and we will get to them after the presentation. And feel free to use the chat box to talk to each other and to us, obviously. We hope that you're following us on Twitter. Malena will put the links and the hashtags, whatever those things are called, in the chat box. But I am now delighted to, sorry, massive crash of thunder. I'm delighted to welcome Dilhani from the Baobab Foundation, and to hand over to you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Geraldine, for that warm introduction. So hi, everyone. It's really lovely to be here with the festival, and really looking forward to talking a bit about the research that we did earlier in the year. Just so that you know a bit about me, so my name's Dilhani. I'm a consultant co-director at the Baobab Foundation, which is a new organisation in the UK. And my background is mixed. I've worked in civil society and in the funding space in the UK and globally over the last 15 years, mostly in issues around youth empowerment and working with women and girls. And I became part of the Baobab story last summer. And like many of us sort of, have been spending a lot of time thinking about the role that I could individually play, but also the role that funders in particular, I was sitting at Comic Relief at that time, should be playing in the context of the impact of COVID-19 on our communities, the impact and the reminder that the killing of George Floyd and the subsequent Black Lives Matters movement, kind of placed on us in terms of our own need to really interrogate how much we have been doing to address the structural inequities facing Black people and communities experiencing racial injustice in the UK. So I'm going to be sharing with you some of the findings from our research study in a moment. I'll share screen in just a second. But before I do that, I did want to just say a little bit about Baobab Foundation in case you haven't heard of us before. So Baobab is a new type of foundation, one that is led by and for Black and ethnic minorities in the UK. We're in a research and design phase. We're about to go into startup mode after July. And our ambition is to really scale the provision of resources to our communities from our communities. So we'll be looking at different resourcing models to leverage our community's own capacity to resource ourselves, as well as working in partnership with different funders and partners in the space. So we're really excited about that. So I'm going to share screen now, and bear with me for one moment. This will probably be the moment it gets really embarrassing and it doesn't work, but hopefully it will. So I'm just going to share screen now. I'm just making sure I'm in full screen mode. Oops. Just one moment. Okay, great. Last year and early this year, we undertook a piece of research, a qualitative piece of research, which is titled Digging Deeper, and this was looking at tailored funding to organisations led by Black people and communities experiencing racial injustice in the UK. So I should be clear that this was a sort of a nationwide piece of work, so not London specific, but I'm hoping that there'll be lots of relevant insights and reflections that are useful for the work that you're doing within the city. So my aim is to take you through the learning review. That'll probably take me about 15 to 20 minutes, maybe a little bit longer. And then we've got a lot of time for Q&A and reflection. So really looking forward to your questions. So why did we do this study? So a few different reasons. I guess as a new organisation with the intention of leveraging resources for Black and brown communities in the UK, we wanted to make sure we were distilling lessons from funders, particularly given the context of the last year and a half that we've been in. And part of that was to inform our own design as an organisation, so looking at our grant making approach and how we want to kind of work with communities in a really respectful and empowering way in the future. But also to support that kind of wider learning agenda, and we collaborated with a number of organisations in the process of designing this study. How we did it. So we did it in a few different ways. So this is primarily a qualitative study that was facilitated through semi-structured conversations. We spoke to 26 respondents and we focused primarily on funders, and the aim of that was to really complement the Ubele study, Bookshare, which I'm sure many of you have read, which focused on civil society's perspective on the last year. And we also collaborated with the Funders for Race Equality Alliance quantitative data study, which I'm sure many of you will have seen as well. If not, I will share those links later in the chat. In terms of our approach, we wanted funders to be really honest. We wanted it to be an honest and open reflection process. So we kept the research very much anonymised, grouped and coded to ensure that we could kind of reflect different perspectives. And we ran a number of validation conversations and workshops to with the draft findings to make sure that that sort of resonated with those who had contributed and with wider voices in the space. In terms of the purpose of the study, it was really to look at what we've learned from the last 12 months of tailored funding on racial justice and also to Black and ethnic minority communities in terms of funding approach. So we were particularly looking at, what the experience was from a practice point of view. So in terms of those grant making rounds, in terms of people's experience of the funding ecosystem as they went through it. So I will continue from here. So we had 6 kind of major theme areas that we identified through the study. The first area focused on shifts in funding, so that's really looking at the money that went out and where it went and who it went to. We focused, obviously, as I mentioned, on qualitative perspectives, knowing that the sort of quantitative data was coming from the Funders for Race Equality Alliance. We looked at funding practice. We also looked at investing for the long haul, so that was really looking at our strategy beyond COVID and beyond this year. We also looked at what I've called digging deeper, so a number of issues that came up through the study that really kind of speak more deeply to our funding policy and practice and where communities might want us to take more assertive action in the future. And we provided recommendations, and we also did some discussions within the review that look specifically at how Baobab can be different as a funder and what it needed to avoid doing and what it needed to amplify in its own approach. Okay, ooh, this is where it stops working. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to go kind of flip straight to the recommendations and I'll kind of work my way backwards. So in terms of future focus, there were sort of 6 key recommendations that we made more broadly around this research. So the first one was, and this won't be a surprise to any of you, but the need to really scale, sustain and retain the flexibility that has been generated through COVID for Black and brown communities in the UK. So I think this is really obvious to most of you, but this is really talking about the need to not treat the last year as a moment in time, but really to build further and additional funding to those communities to make that long term. So many of the organisations that we spoke to only had funding that was attached to COVID, and most of that funding was short term. Positively, a lot of that funding was flexible. But that needed to be maintained. Many organisations talked about their sort of long-term history being very much with project funding and not having sufficient support really to deliver on their wider ambitions and strategies as an organisation. So a real focus on scaling and sustaining investment into communities. The second recommendation, an area for future focus, is really addressing significant geographical and intersectional disparities. And this is obviously very much in the context of a UK-wide review. So in the conversations and the data that we were able to look at, there were quite significant differences, as you might expect, between London and the rest of the UK, including the 4 nations. And some of that was disproportionate in terms of population scale, and you can kind of see the data for that from the Funders Race Equality Alliance data. There were also significant areas of disparity for particular groups that faced multiple levels of oppression. So that included, in particular, Black disabled people, people coming from Gypsy, Roma, and traveller communities, women, and also, in particular, the Black trans community in the UK. So these might be groups that we might want to dial up our active outreach in terms of looking at ways we can work with those communities in a more meaningful way. The third recommendation that we made was around relational investing and field building, and this really came up very strongly from the BME organisations and infrastructure groups that we spoke to. So in particular, groups don't want to be treated as recipients for funding. They want to be treated as partners, as organisations that we might go to when we're looking at how we address particular issues within our strategy or our grant making themes. So for example, rather than just going to a group because we want to increase funding to the BME sector, looking at how those communities are better integrated, for example, into our strategy on child poverty and being seen as a stakeholder in that agenda if they're working in that space. And the second part around field building was sort of really acknowledging, because of the historical lack of investment within the space, and I'm using the word space quite intentionally because many of the people I spoke to do not see that there is a classic sector in the way that we might say there's an education sector or a health sector, but actually that organisations led by BME communities occupy multiple spaces. They may be led by and occupying a space that is about identity and racial disparity. They may be occupying a space that is led by a thematic priority such as mental health or education, and the stakeholder network might be very different therefore. Or they might be doing a bit of both, or in a different space completely. And so the need to support communities across these spaces to network, to support there to be, where possible, that kind of building of unity, of a common voice, common approaches, learning, collaboration, all of that would be really important and emerged from the research as something that was really important to those organisations and communities. The fourth area for me is a really important one, and I'd be really interested to hear your reflections and your own experience of this from your particular context. But the overwhelming view that I got through the research is, while funding was going to BME organisations and communities, very few people believed that this was focused on racial justice. So primarily because the funding was focused on the immediate requirements and needs of COVID, rather than addressing the systemic levels of oppression or inequalities that had resulted in those inequities that people were experiencing. So a real desire to actually dial up the focus very explicitly on racial justice. And I would say from respondents within the study, particularly people of colour, within funding institutions and within infrastructure bodies, very much feeling that funders were nervous about being explicit on the term racial justice, and that actually, this is doing a real disservice to the agenda and to the importance of making the follow-up from COVID and from 2020 something more meaningful in the context of how funders respond to the challenges that communities are still facing in 2021. The second part of this was also about taking an intersectional lens, so really recognising that the BME community is not homogenous, and actually when people experience oppression, it's not one-dimensional. So needing to sort of really develop a nuanced understanding of intersectionality when you're approaching a particular audience or community, or even an issue. Um, so, for example, if we are working with Black disabled women in the context of education, recognizing that there are going to be multiple layers of oppression that might affect that particular community that you're trying to reach. Um, the fifth area was really around challenging fund distribution and investment strategies and policies. So I'll go into this a little bit more later, but this really is looking at who is being successful at securing those more significant funding contracts within our funding ecosystem. Is that fair? Is that diverse? Does that give opportunities to new actors and emerging actors to sort of take up the mantle? And then for funders to really look at how, not only who their money goes out to, but how is their money being managed and being held? Where does it come from? And where is it being banked? And so that's really talking about how do we think about our responsibility in increasing the ethical value of the resources that we hold by actively divesting away from institutions or banks or businesses or investment policies that we know that are potentially doing harm to a racial justice agenda. And also, you know, thinking more positively about how we advance the cause through those decisions. And the final one is probably also really obvious as well, but really important because it came up so much, is the need for funders to adapt to the conditions of and the needs of communities that they served, and not the other way around. And there was a real sense of a mixed experience in this space. I would say that from the respondents that I spoke to, there was a sense that you know, that move towards participatory funding and being more responsive has emerged through and from COVID, but it's new practice in this particular space. It's obviously not new practice in general, and that was a real desire to continue to deepen and extend that work, and to ensure that that becomes the sort of base standard for how we work with communities experiencing and affected by racial injustice. So I just wanted to read out the quote that's here at the side. Racial justice work is not always seen as charitable or a funder priority. You may find it embedded within programs on inequality, but it is rarely stated explicitly. And I wanted to kind of reflect that, because that was something that particularly came out from those colleagues that I spoke to who were people of colour and coming from minoritized organisations. So I'm going to move forward to the next slide. Okay, so first of all, sort of looking at shifts in funding. So a lot of this is not going to be unfamiliar to you. And I must say that since obviously we did this at the start of the year, a huge amount more data is now available in the space for us to kind of use and digest. But I think most of it kind of you know, very much reinforces our kind of hypotheses that we found through the study. So the first is that, you know, there has been a massive increase in scale and flexibility and the types of tools being used by funders within both the BME space and within the racial justice space, and this has been hugely welcomed by communities and infrastructure organisations across the board. So that's been really positive. The challenge has been actually through the kind of COVID-19 period, we've actually got a much clearer sense of the shape and size of the sector, and it's obvious that demand has far outstripped provision overall. Obviously, London Funders has done amazingly well in sort of meeting that need, but I'm very much talking about and at a national level. So, for example, there's a couple of examples that I've pulled out here from the funders that were part of this process. So, for resourcing racial justice, they had over 1,400 applications to their rounds, totaling 33 million. £500,000. I think they were able to give out approximately £1 million in funding. And similarly, you can see for the Phoenix Fund, which was overseen by the lottery, a fairly similar story as well. So very much at a national level, we've got significant differences in terms of demand versus provision. I guess what I find powerful is that we actually know that there is a significant BME-led space in this country that is looking for support, and hopefully has a huge amount to offer. The third that we already spoke about earlier, and I won't go into it therefore in so much detail, is the sort of challenges around geographical and intersectional disparities. And I kind of want to talk a little bit about the geographical disparities, and this is interesting as well because it also connected to some communities that are part of that Greater London area as well. In terms of some of the challenges that communities talked about in terms of their local funding environment and how progressive and supportive that was. So you might imagine, particularly for those groups outside of London that are more likely to be very hidden, working in potentially a increasingly hostile political environment where it comes to issues of racial equality, and also working potentially with funding committees and networks that are less knowledgeable and less confident, and potentially don't even prioritise or see race as an issue. And we certainly had that feedback from a couple of respondents. So, one of the reasons I want to reinforce that is for not all groups are working in a safe and positive funding environment locally, and that's really important for us to kind of recognise, acknowledge, and think about what role we can play in advancing the space for them. And as I spoke about before, in terms of that funding picture, the surge in funding has primarily been felt around the COVID-19 response. It's not really been a racial justice response, and it's also not been a response that has radically shifted the funding picture for BME infrastructure and community organisations. Certainly it's the case that many of those infrastructure organisations that we will know well have significantly more opportunities in the pipeline than they did 12 months ago, which is fantastic. But at the point that we did this review in January, February time, very few of them had secured funding beyond COVID and beyond April 2021. So still, a very precarious situation. And in speaking to some of those organisations that I continue to be in contact with, I would say that there is still a significant need to ensure that we are providing core, strategic, potentially unrestricted support where possible, and we're helping those organisations to understand what that means. Very few organisations have had the privilege of thinking about how core and unrestricted funding can support their whole organisation, and not simply turn that into a project. So that's something that I think is very much upon funders to help organisations really take advantage of in the right way. Okay, so moving on to the next slide. Okay, so the next piece that we looked at was funding practice. And I'll just read this quote out. It is common practice for BME-led women's organisations to ask for less than they need. So really what we were hearing, and there was a few quotes like this from different people, and what we were hearing was that because of the sort of traditional scarcity of funding, and there was still obviously scarcity and competition during this period, organisations are often asking for less than they need. So funders were generally dealing with proposals that looked inadequate for what they were trying to do. And that kind of came from a couple of places. So some of that was, trying to avoid rejection. but also, just out of a sense of not really knowing what they could apply for. So it kind of reinforces the point I made earlier. So in terms of improvements, we saw some improvements in funder practice, especially in application processes and consultation. It was acknowledged, and we need to remind ourselves that this didn't emerge immediately off the bat, that there were many challenges right at the start of the rollout of the sort of COVID-19 funding for many communities, that felt that application processes were still burdensome, and that many funders had failed to include appropriate and meaningful representation from those communities, but that did improve over time, and that provides us a basis to build on. I think the second key thing for me is that lived experience funders and organisations have played a critical role in advancing funding practice in this space, and I'm thinking about people like Resourcing Racial Justice, Do It Now, and other kind of buy and fall led organisations that took on funding roles during this time. So like the Bellets, the Runnymede Trust, IMCAN, and there are many, many other organisations that I'm not named that that have taken on new roles in order to kind of meet the demand and to provide that kind of relational experience for communities. Some of the challenges that still remain. So this came up quite a lot. Risk, as we define it often as funders, remains kind of a significant barrier to equity and innovation in the field, and many respondents felt that this was racialised, that risk was being used as a reason to not fund buy and for led organisations and communities. And the kind of willingness to take risks in the positive sense was less likely to be applied in the context of a buy and for led organisation. Now that's a perception, but we know many of us as funders from practice that buy and for led initiatives tend to feature less in many funder portfolios. It's often has been historically there have been more challenges for those communities to kind of break through our funding processes and requirements of due diligence. And so there was a real kind of impetus here to kind of shift our approach and to work towards something that was much more enabling. And so in identifying potential risks, how can funders support an organisation or a community to take up funding, but to do that effectively and successfully? The fourth area, which I'm going to talk about in a moment, was that there were a number of areas of feedback around how issues of race, trauma and intersectionality are being dealt with within funder strategies and approaches, and essentially a need to really deepen that and bring that out across the piece. I'm just going to move on for time so we can get to our questions. Okay, so we've talked about a lot about this, so I'm not going to go over it again apart from the ones that I've not spoken to. So investing for the long haul, that multi-year, long-term flexible funding, non-financial support, absolutely critical for organisations in this space, and a real sense of this not just being, about funders putting in place training programs, but looking at how funders can help communities to leverage other types of support, like different revenue streams, like networks, like access to other funders, like coaching and mentoring, and also networking within the sector. I'm going to move on. Okay. So just coming to this piece around the four areas that we're really asked to dig deeper as funders, and I'm just going to read out these quotes because I think they really speak to some of the issues that were being raised. building safe spaces in grant making and philanthropic practice is critical when we're working with communities dealing with trauma and ongoing oppression. So for me, one of the call outs from this research was really for funders to be more explicit and more, um, conscious of how their processes may actually be doing harm to communities that are already dealing with harm. And this is so important. We know this already when we work with organisations led by lived experience communities. And so, some of the recommendations we made was really starting to think about how do we build more culturally competent and also trauma-informed funding approaches as organisations. So what can we do to reduce the potential for harm? And some of the ways in which organisations talked about this were really quite simple but really powerful and important. So one, timetables. Having more reasonable and flexible timetables around our funding approach, funding rounds, making sure the due diligence requirements were flexible and achievable for a wider number of organisations, looking at the types of questions that we're asking. Are we asking questions that are essentially kind of forcing communities to validate or retell their experiences of trauma and injustice? And so a lot of the recommendations were centred around flipping questions from things like, tell us why your community is most in need, to tell us how our support can make the biggest difference to the work that you're trying to do. So language is also really important in this as well. When we think about intersectionality, Black disabled people are often homogenised with the experience of white disabled people, as is often the case for Black and ethnic minority women. So this came up quite a lot. So the need to ensure that we're really acknowledging the different power dynamics and privilege and the nuances around oppression for different communities, and making sure we're really offering space and holding space for by and for led organisations, really targeting with technical and lived experience of the communities we're talking about, giving them space to be seen and heard and supported in our processes. Some of the challenges that kind of came up around this as well also, I guess, came up around fund distribution. So I sense that Black-led intersectional communities were essentially losing out to white-led intersectional communities who were then leading programs to try and reach these groups, but then not having necessarily the expertise or networks to do that. And so, I think one of the challenges to think about as we go forward is how do we either create more positive partnerships where these communities are at the table, or where do we really push ourselves to go direct and work directly with communities that have been traditionally left out, and provide that support and opportunity for them to lead in the space in a way that they haven't been allowed to previously. And then the final perspective was around capacity and risk. So we need to debunk certain perspectives on the state of the BME groups. And this was obviously specific to the UK. There's a perception that there's something lacking that we can't invest in. It's a deficit-led model. It borders on institutional racism. And this came up a lot as well. So there was a real sense that often when we talk about the challenges of capacity within organisations led by and for BME communities, that this was a reason not to fund, and that this was, not the same treatment that other organisations might receive. And then once again, that this was almost a kind of excuse to avoid really funders embedding themselves in this space and in this issue. Um, so, for me, when I think about this, there's a real need to sort of go beyond the language of capacity and risk and be quite specific about what are the challenges that we're talking about. Is this a challenge of an institution's track record in working on a specific issue? Is it about the fact that their accounts are reported in a certain way? Is it about the pipeline of funding they have going forward? Is it about the fact that maybe they don't have a finance team or a technical fundraiser, or whatever it is that might be uh, resulting in a perception of increased risk? And all of those things potentially being solvable depending on your approach and how you work with your funding, with your communities. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to stop there and I'm going to open it up for questions. I've put a couple of prompts in the chat in case that's useful. So I'd be really interested to hear, what your experiences are, what examples of good or progressive practice that you've seen, particularly over the last year. Obviously, we know globally there's a huge amount of learning that's happening also in this space. I will stop there. I think I'll hand it back to Geraldine.
Thank you, Dilhani. Thank you, Dilhani. That was really thoughtful and really thought-provoking. So much to think about there. We've had a few questions through, but I just wanted to start by reflecting on the experience that we've had in London through the London community response. Starting to, from about April last year, be explicit about wanting to prioritise the communities who were most affected by COVID, and then going on a journey with a group of equity partners. And I think one of the really interesting things for us was working with those equity partners as a group. So not just working with Ubaili, but working with Ubaili and Inclusion London and Consortium and the Women's Resource Centre, and the conversations between funders and all of those groups together, and I think that's where we started to develop our understanding of, the value of the human rights approach and the questions that we asked over time, or the data that the data that we collected from applicants, not about, who's on your, are you led by, because you have, percentages of people on your trustee board or whatever, but also about the work that you do, who is your work targeted at, how do you do that work, give any examples of human rights approaches, which meant that funders were able to make very nuanced decisions about where the funding was going. And I think we're at the beginning of a journey. I think we're absolutely at the beginning of a journey in London. But yes, it feels. There is a report we just published on Friday, actually, which is on our website, about the equity journey of the London community response. Well, I'll drop a link into the chat box for everyone. But let's take a couple of questions. There's a question here about the link between BAME communities and faith organisations. So the fact that those faith organisations won't take money from the lottery, or many of them won't take money from the lottery, and that is, that's a big proportion of the funding sector. And does that have an impact as well on BAME communities, on the amount of funding that's getting to BAME communities?
I think this is it's a really important reflection, and it's an important question. So, this has come up a lot for us as Baobab, as we're working through our strategy process with, we have almost 200 organisations in the network, and many are coming from different faith communities. So very aware of the fact that, certain religions aren't able to take funding from the lottery and or other types of institutions. So I think there's a couple of things that I want to sort of reflect in there. So one is, the growing the funding ecosystem that is both led by and for, and is working with a range of BME communities, including faith communities, is critical. We wouldn't have even been talking about that a couple of years ago as funders. So bringing this kind of into the space is really important, but the action is also as important, because what it means is we do need to have a range of different funding platforms for communities to access. It cannot all just come from government. It cannot all come from one source. And I certainly saw at an earlier point within the sort of COVID response efforts and the sort of difficulties that people were having around the kind of conversation about BME community, the sense of like, let's all like just, let's just have one thing and one solution. That works if you've got kind of like the London Funders model where you've got collaboration happening across multiple spaces. But if that's not happening, then that's really challenging for communities. That's like saying we should only have one education charity in the UK. So that would be sort of half of my response. The other bit that I think funders sort of need to really reflect on is that actually, like many communities, but particularly within the BME space, faith plays a really important role in how communities come together and how they take action. And so there are a number of funders that still have a discomfort and a different set of criteria for how you have to demonstrate the value and the impact of your community work if you're coming from a faith-led organisation. And we certainly saw last week at the event we were hosting, many communities felt that that they were having to sort of prove that they weren't, I never say this word right, proselytizing, but
Yes.
essentially having to prove that they weren't, doing this, but also, feeling that they had to kind of hide their faith from their application and from their projects. And actually, what we want to be able to do is allow communities to acknowledge who they are and where they're coming from, and to be able to bring the different aspects of their values and beliefs, not in a political way, or not in a way that we're sort of converting people's views, but in a way that just acknowledges this is one of my drivers for why I do this work. So I think for me that was really important. And we had a number of organisations, particularly from the Islamic community, that were sort of actively talking about quite negative experiences with funders in assessment processes where, they were essentially being quizzed about their views and beliefs in a way that I think, in other spaces that would be quite disrespectful. I think that's really important. I don't know if
Yeah.
I really answered your question, but I hope that's useful for everyone.
Yes, no, absolutely. And I think the value of faith communities and networks has been so apparent, hasn't it, over the last year, in terms of, being able to get help to people quickly and being in touch with the people who need the help. So yes, really, really interesting. I think it's fascinating that you're talking about the words that we use when we talk about civil society organisations. So we talk about Black-led civil society organisations or trauma-informed approaches in delivery, and actually applying those words to the funding sector is, that there's some real challenges there. And we've got a couple of questions, of course, about the demographics of staff in funding organisations, and about the relationship between that and the lack of funding that has gone to Black and minority organisations previously. A very interesting, apparently in the US, some foundations have introduced time-limited terms for staff to encourage a transition from an all-white team. Is that the kind of thing we ought to be challenging funders to do in the UK?
I mean, I'm tend to be a very radical person. For those of you who do know me, or if you don't know me, I'm part of the sort of sort of shifting power movement. So really moving power, decisions, resources as close to communities as we possibly can. So therefore, for funders that have been traditionally not only white led, but often in historically, coming from very privileged communities socioeconomically, coming from certain parts of the country, maybe not having other forms of diversity within their teams. It's absolutely important, actually, that if for me, this is my personal view, if we're true to our agenda, we need to be sort of thinking about how our teams and our leadership and our boards reflect the communities that we're trying to serve, and that they are part of us. They're not separate to us. They're not just a group that we consult, but
Mm.
they're really embedded in us. And if we're therefore moving from a very disparate kind of institution and leadership, then I do think that brave leadership is about looking at those sorts of questions and making those sorts of changes. And certainly we at Comic Relief, we went through a year and a half of really setting very clear and specific targets around how we were going to address diversity and inclusion within our institution, and thinking very specifically about the space that both racial justice and also Black voices would hold within the organisation, sort of really looking at those different layers of power and privilege, within our organisations. I tend to think that, and I can say this as a South Asian woman, we do see some South Asian voices within philanthropy, but certainly from my experience, when you look across the board, it is more challenging um, for people from Black communities to move into those positions of leadership as well. So we really have to think very actively about how we foster that change.
Mm.
It's really uncomfortable, but I always say think it about it from the other side. We create the change we want to see. So,
Yeah.
I like to think if I jumped out of my seat at Comic Relief, and I believe somebody younger and more dynamic came through into that seat, and that's a wonderful thing.
That is, well, I'm off to hand my notice in. I think, no, but I think we've had some really I mean, this has been really inspiring, really thought-provoking. We've had some other great sessions throughout the last few days on this topic, and I'm really struck by Baljit from the Centre for Knowledge Equity, who talked about this is not just, we shouldn't just do this because we ought to do it, but actually because it makes our organisations better. We make better decisions as a result. Yeah, really inspiring stuff. Thank you so much, Dilhani, for your time today. We've loved having you. This is recorded, so it'll be available on our YouTube channel, or whatever it is we do with it at some point. And just a reminder to everyone here that we have, tomorrow is our final day of the festival, and we have some 6 more fabulous sessions to have to take us through to the end. So if you want to pop back onto the website and see what you'd like to come to tomorrow, we'd love to have you. But I'm going to close it now. Huge thanks again to you, Dilhani, one more time, and do go to the report and have a proper read, because it's really good stuff in there.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Have a good evening, everyone.